Hello, and welcome to the Justin Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program. Today, I just want to give you all a quick reminder, as always, that Just and Sinner is a donor-supported organization. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, which means any gifts you give are tax-deductible. You can go to justandsinner.org, go to our donate page, and figure out how it is that you can help us. I also want to remind you that our organization, Just and Sinner, has an academic division called the Widener Institute, and through the Widener Institute we publish various materials, but we also offer courses and seminars. The seminars or courses are offered live on a monthly basis, and we also have a vast and growing video library of courses. You can go to justandsinner.org, go to our Widener Institute page, and we have an option for you to join what is called a school, S-K-O-O-L, website, where you are able to get access to all of our videos, a number of book and PDF materials, and you can interact live with the fellows there, including me. And this also includes some live interaction a couple times a month through a book study. So again, justandsinner.org. I'll put a link to the school page down there as well. Well, today on the program, we are going to be discussing the doctrine of papal infallibility. Now, this is something that I have really wanted to do for quite a long time. I did a video on the papacy. This is like a podcast on the papacy that I don't even know if the whole thing is actually on video on my website. A number of years ago at this point, it's probably 5-ish years ago. And I have wanted to revisit that. That is certainly, it's an older video, and that's not to say that the arguments that are made there do not hold up, but I would like to do something that is a little bit more in depth on the issue of the papacy. And so, as most of you know, if you're watching or listening to this, many people are converting to Rome. Many people are converting to Rome on kind of a bigger level in terms of there are a lot of well-known personalities that have joined the Roman Catholic Church, and there are a lot of reasons for that in terms of things that are happening culturally, which I think is leading a lot of that. And Rome is seen as kind of this bulwark for traditionalism in some way in the midst of a culture that seems to change its values and its understanding of truth every 5 seconds. And so there is a certain appeal that Rome has, I think, because of the doctrines of Rome, but more so the kind of authority that Rome portrays itself to be. And so I totally understand all of that, especially when people are coming from certain Christian traditions where, well, there isn't really much of a tradition. You know, things that are the result of kind of American revivalism, non-denominational churches where there is no rootedness, there is no real tradition, there is no real understanding of history, perhaps the service and the way that the Christian life is viewed is really much more experiential and based upon one's feelings rather than something that is actually rooted in clear doctrine or clear history that ties you to Christians who lived 1,500 years ago or whatever. And as I've thought through a lot of these Roman Catholic issues, which I've done plenty, I have thought through the question of what's really the primary issue, right? Or in other words, people ask me this pretty regularly, which is, what is the one thing that Rome could prove to you that would make you convert to Rome? And the answer, I think, is pretty obvious, and that it's always the same, which is the office of the papacy. And I think in many ways, the doctrine of Rome or the claims of Rome really hinge upon this. The claim that is made that the one who is the Bishop of Rome is indeed in the chair of St. Peter, is the Vicar of Christ, and has been granted this special status by Jesus himself. And so that in some way, where the Bishop of Rome is, there the church is. And so when we're dealing with Roman Catholic claims, and we could talk about other things, and we can talk about the cult of the saints, and I've done a series on that. I still want to get back to that, by the way. I never actually finished the last part of that I wanted to do, so at some point I want to get back to that. But it's been years, but I do want to get back to that. But even the questions of like sola scriptura, depending on how you respond to that, right? Even if you reject sola scriptura, that doesn't prove Rome right, because there are other traditions that claim to have infallible traditions or some kind of tradition that put together the canon of Scripture, just as Rome claims. So you have the Eastern Orthodox tradition, but you also have the Coptic churches or the other Syrian churches of the East and others. So Rome really, I think, does stand or fall with this issue. Just as Luther said the same about the doctrine of justification for the veracity of the Lutheran confession. And so that means if we're really wrestling with Rome and the claims that Rome makes, and doing so honestly, of course, if the Pope really is the vicar of Christ, if Jesus really did set him up as the head of the church, then yeah, I guess I'll submit to him. I should, right? And you should as well if those claims are valid. So those claims need to then be questioned and challenged. So this is really the primary issue. So with all of that being said, what I am doing here is starting a series of videos that are going to explore the claims of the papacy, and specifically they're dealing with the question of papal infallibility. Now, papal infallibility is merely one facet of the claims that the Bishop of Rome makes for himself, but they're the kind of highest, it's the height of all of those claims in terms of what the Pope is claiming about himself and what Rome declares about the office of the papacy. And so when we're exploring papal infallibility, we're going to be looking at the history, the theology, the arguments that were present in the First Vatican Council in 1870, which is where papal infallibility was declared a dogma of the Church. Now, I've looked at a number of sources. I have a number of materials that I'm working my way through, still working my way through many of these. And these resources or materials that I'm looking at, some of them are those that are defenses of papal infallibility, others are critiques of papal infallibility, and the critiques come from both Protestants as well as some of those within Rome or who left Rome to form the Old Catholic Church. So I'm trying to get a wide range of texts that are dealing with these questions. But what I'm not doing here, at least here, and this doesn't mean I'm not going to be doing this, but what I haven't done here yet is examine the more contemporary text dealing with arguments for the papacy, because what I'm really trying to hone in on for this particular series is what were the actual claims that were being made at Vatican I, and what were the arguments that were being produced at that time? Because something that I have found within a lot of Roman Catholic apologetics is that the arguments that are made by apologists today seem to be significantly different in some areas than the arguments that were actually being made when certain things were declared dogma. I've pointed this out before in terms of the Council of Trent and the way that justification was understood. I would much rather go back and read the people who were actually, writing the Tridentine definition of justification and say, what were their arguments? What did they understand their words to mean? I would much rather look there than look at how it is that someone who's working with Newman's development hypothesis might interpret the canons of Trent today. That doesn't mean it's not worth doing that, but I think it's really important to grab onto historical context to say, what are the actual issues being debated at this time? So, no, I don't have the Eliakim discussion here. That doesn't mean we're not going to get into it, but at least I have not run across anyone making an argument like that at this particular time. Okay, so we're going to be doing some history, and then we're going to look at the arguments. We're going to be doing some textual analysis of the text of Scripture, and then we're also going to be looking at the actual decrees of Vatican I, as well as what was claimed by theologians at this time. So we're going to really start with the history today. And I do have a slide at the end, as I mentioned, that's going to tell you the sources that I used if you want to check some of this out yourself. The context of Vatican I. What exactly is going on here? Well, let's talk about just what's going on kind of politically at this time. There's a lot of turmoil within Europe. And this turmoil is not just in Europe. I mean, you have it in the United States as well in many ways. And we're talking 1870, so we're speaking, 100 years after the American Revolution. However, the kind of revolutionary spirit that is happening, or that is becoming more prominent throughout Europe, is something that has affected Europe far beyond the end of the 18th century. And so there are a lot of crises that the West is facing at this time, which Vatican I desires to answer. So what's important here is to say that Vatican I does not just arise out of theological concerns, and that doesn't mean it doesn't deal with theological concerns. All right, so let me just talk a little bit about how there's this kind of connection going on here between what is being discussed within these theological or ecclesiological debates and then what is happening politically in many different ways. And there are significant debates throughout Europe about government structure that then mirror views of ecclesiastical authority. So you see this, for example, in England, during someone like John Locke's time, who's often considered the father of liberalism, where you have various parties in England, and some of those are the more committed Anglicans, those who are committed to the office of the episcopacy, as essential to the nature of the church, and those same individuals that have this view about ecclesiastical authority tend to also be strong supporters of the monarchy. On the other hand, in England, you have those who are Puritans, and the Puritans rejected a strongly hierarchical structure of the church generally. Now, Puritan is a very broad term, so you can include some Anglicans in there. But they also were strong supporters of the Parliament and not the monarchy. And we're not talking about England here, but the reason that I bring that up is just to give an example of the fact that there are these very important connections between what someone thinks politically and then what somebody thinks theologically at this time. We tend to separate those things because we do not live in Christendom, at least in the way that such a thing existed at this particular time in history. And so we're dealing here more so with the Roman Catholic world. So we're not dealing specifically with England, but we should think more about France. The French Revolution, 1789. The French Revolution was really one of the most horrific and awful events in history. The French Revolution is sometimes compared to the American Revolution because they, in some ways, arise out of the same type of fervor, but they are very different. Very different in motivation, very different in content and context, even though there are, it is true, some of the same figures who have connections to the American and the French revolutions. Thomas Paine would be, an example of this. Of course, he's basically rejected by the founding fathers of the United States by the time he goes over to France. But the point is that there's this revolutionary fervor that is brewing within France, and that revolutionary fervor is a rejection of all prior, both political and ecclesiastical authorities. The French Revolution was very explicitly and purposefully secular, in a way that the American Revolution really was not, though I don't want to get into that particular debate here. Now, in France, there were kind of extreme positions that are being taken, far more extreme than you find the divides in England or in the United States, where you have the extreme radical groups, the extreme radical liberals, which is what shows up at the French. These are the leaders of the French Revolution, largely taken from the philosophy of Rousseau and some others. But then you also have these very strong monarchical proponents who are counter-Enlightenment figures. And you have some of these in England as well, by the way. So when John Locke writes his famous two treatises on government, he is writing those in response to someone who is a very strong monarchical thinker, who's a pretty interesting thinker, actually, which should kind of be worth exploring. But so Joseph de Maistre, his years are 1753 to 1821, is this key counter-Enlightenment figure in France, who is a very strong supporter of papal supremacy, a very strong supporter of the French monarchy. And Maistre is often regarded as one of the most influential and important conservative thinkers of this time, though the kind of conservatism that you find in someone like de Maistre is very different from what you would find in, say, a Lutheran conservative writer like Frederick Julius Stahl, who I have a number of videos on. Now, during this time, this is the rise of the Enlightenment, you have the growth of rationalism. Rationalism is a movement, and it's broad and what you're referring to when you use the term rationalism. But generally speaking, rationalism is a movement that is defined by the use of unaided reason to arrive at significant understanding of the way the world works, but also to understand the way that the world should be and how to get there. In other words, within a rationalist approach to the state, the discussions of political policy or political structure arise largely from these kind of rational thought experiments. So you see this within the early liberal political thinkers, like someone like Thomas Hobbes would be a great example of this, who's the kind of great pre-liberal, but you see this in thinkers following that, such as in the French Revolution at its more extreme, most extreme form. But essentially, the rationalists think through these thought experiments, think about things like, well, what is the nature of humanity? What is the nature of humanity without government? How would humanity function without a government? And then in light of those questions or what they've determined in terms of how humanity would function without a government, then they say, okay, well, in that kind of state, or what they call a state of nature, what could the government or should the government do in order to put things in order or to make sense of things? And so what Maistre and many others, counter-revolutionaries argue is that these kind of rationalist attempts to define or create a government just based out of pure human rationality, without taking into account theological authorities and without taking into account really the development of cultures and nations in history, this is always going to lead to this question of, well, how do we know that anybody has any real legitimate authority? And this is a question that's faced by John Locke that really leads those two treatises. This question of, well, what is a legitimate authority? What authority should we be obeying? And then how do we justify resistance to a legitimate authority? And in what circumstances is resistance to an authority justified? And so the rationalist premises generally view the state or government as something that is formed out of the free consent of a group of people. Now, if the government is formed out of this just free consent of a group of people, the question of legitimate government then largely boils down to, well, whether or not those people decide that that person is still someone to be obeyed. And so there is a concern that if the foundation of government is something that is just due to human consent, then we can also just take away that consent and then just decide that, well, I don't think that authority is legitimate anymore. And during this age of these revolutions and revolutions following Maistre's death as well throughout the mid-19th century, and then we have the Marxist revolutions as well after that, this is a question that everybody is asking. And there are a lot of theological and political answers to this question. So if you read a lot of theological thinkers in the 19th century that deal with ethical questions at all, they spend a lot of time on questions of what is legitimate authority and when can you resist legitimate authority, because these are real challenges that are being faced at this time. And so Maistre is concerned that the growth of Enlightenment thought is essentially going to lead to constant social revolutions and complete breakdown of European society. And so in order to fight against this revolutionary attitude, this fear that society is just going to break down or collapse as a whole, which is a totally legitimate fear because, it kind of happens in France, and many Christians of all different stripes are all concerned about this same thing, Maistre proposes that we need a strong, singular, centralized authority. And if we have this singular, strong authority and basically give kind of all power to that one person, instead of simply saying that power really just comes from the people who could change their mind on a whim if they feel like it, that is going to vest that particular individual with the needed authority wherein there isn't going to be this kind of constant questioning as to whether this person is legitimate. Because authority is kind of a top-down thing, right? So they talk about this as the divine right of kings, that God basically grants his authority there directly or indirectly, or different ways of expressing the divine right of kings, but directly or indirectly to the king, and authority then flows down from the king. Well, your question of legitimate authority is basically resolved. Okay, well, it comes directly from God, given to the king, so you got to obey the king. There's really no ifs, ands, or buts about it, right? You're kind of just stuck there. And Filmer, in England does something very similar, who's the one that John Locke is responding to, though he has this whole theory that God granted all authority to Adam, and there's this almost apostolic succession of monarchical authority from Adam on. Again, it's an interesting theory, which should be worth exploring, but not totally relevant to this. So then Maestra's main point here is to say that government authority, if anyone's going to respect it at all and not just constantly revolt when they don't like it, governmental authority must depend upon something more objective. And what is more objective than government authority is religious authority, because religious authority comes directly and clearly from God. And that means de Maistre believes that religious authority, which is the highest authority, is centered in one centralized figure, just as he sees that political authority is, and that centralized figure is the Pope. And so all authority, in many ways, in any earthly context whatsoever, whether it's political or religious, is centered in that individual, that is the Pope. And so the Pope really has ultimate authority in de Maistre's system. This is his way to deal with the crisis that's occurring in the 18th century. De Maistre believes that monarchy is the only divinely established way to structure the state. And so this is not merely one option among many. It's not just that he is a monarchist because he prefers monarchy. No, instead, he's saying this is the form of government that God has established. Of course, the Old Testament had a monarchy. Of course, God warns about the dangers of having a king and essentially tells the people of Israel not to, but they do anyway. But this monarchical model then follows the way that the church is structured. And so the monarch is the highest political authority in an earthly sense. However, that monarch still is under the greatest spiritual authority on earth, which arises in the form of the Pope. And so the Pope in de Maistre's system has absolute authority over both spiritual and temporal matters. And so all of this is really essential to understand what are the kinds of debates that are going on by the time we get to Vatican II. Now, this is a bit before Vatican II, but Vatican II is responding to what is this continued crisis that people like de Maistre are dealing with. So there's a little bit of the background of the crisis. Now let's talk about the actual individuals that are involved in Vatican II, or Vatican I specifically. So this is Pope Pius IX. Pope Pius IX, his years are 1792 to 1878, so he lives a very long life, especially without modern medicine in the way that it's developed in the 20th century. And he is elected to the papal office in 1846. He is the longest reigning pope in history, having reigned in that office for a full 32 years. Well, Rome would make the argument that Peter served a little bit longer than that, but I don't grant that Peter was a pope in the sense that Rome speaks about it. So I'm going to say that Pope Pius IX is the longest reigning in history. Now, Pope Pius IX is not really an intellectual force. You know, you have these popes sometimes who are just clear kind of intellectual giants. So Benedict XVI was very much that way. He was primarily first an academic. Or even you have somebody like Pope Gregory. I think Pope Gregory was a great theological mind in many ways. Going back to the first Pope Gregory, the first medieval pope, they say, 600-ish we're talking about here. But Pius is not a very strong theological, intellectual figure, though he is perceived as a very strong leader. So, though initially Pope Pius IX, as interesting as this is, was considered somewhat of a liberal and a little bit of a modernist, Pope Pius IX changed significantly after the 1848 revolutions. Now, the 1848 revolutions, there are a series of revolutions, kind of mini revolutions, that occur all throughout Europe. And so this is in Germany and France and other places. And Pope Pius IX, when he sees this, becomes far more skeptical about where modernity has been leading people. He's seeing this in a very practical way. The 1848 revolutions really shape a lot of people, so this is not just Pius either. And so after 1848, Pius IX starts to reconsider what his role is as the Pope, as the Bishop of Rome. And he essentially arises at the belief that the papacy, or the office of the Pope, has ultimate temporal and spiritual authority. So there is this increased emphasis now on the temporal authority of the office of the papacy. It's a long history until we get to this connection between the papacy and temporal authority, and we might further explore some of that as we look at the history of the popes. And Pius essentially argued that the church could not and should not act independently of the authority of the Pope. Because what you had was the creation of various constitutional states. And so Pius IX leads to a lot of skepticism from Americans toward Roman Catholics in the United States. Because at least the way that Pius is sometimes perceived is that he is an enemy of constitutionalism altogether. Now, within a constitutional state, there is an independence of the church from temporal authorities. Now, the questions of how independent is the church is not always easy to resolve. There isn't one kind of constitutionalist answer to that, because there are many constitutions. We're not just talking about the United States here. And Pope Pius moves largely against constitutional conceptions because he believes that this strong separation between church and state that he sees happening is essentially going to allow states to fall into significant temporal error and also theological error. So he's concerned about the embracing of the errors of modernism both within the church and within the state, and he believes that increasing his own authority, or papal authority, following him as well, would put an end to some of that. All right, so Pope Pius IX, prior to Vatican I, makes some of these papal declarations that are very, very important, and set the groundwork in many ways for what happens at Vatican I. And so what we see at Vatican I does not just show up out of nowhere. Now, at this time, there are some debates about Marian dogma. There are debates about exactly what kind of veneration should be offered to the Blessed Mother, and there are also debates about this question of the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception of Mary, to be clear, the Immaculate Conception is not a reference to the virgin birth of Jesus. People often confuse those two things. The Immaculate Conception of Mary is the dogma that states that when Mary was conceived in the womb of her mother Anna, it's not a virgin conception or birth, but that there is this miraculous act of erasing original sin, or the consequences and penalties of original sin from the Virgin Mary, so that at her birth, Mary was free from original sin. This is something that affects only Mary. It is not true of any other human being in history, and the arguments for this largely depend upon the intimacy between Mary and the one who she bears in her womb, to say that there is this special cleansing of Mary, that she is like the ark, she's the place where God is present, and therefore she has this special act of cleansing and grace because the presence of the Son, or the Logos, is so holy that he can only dwell in something that is purely holy, and therefore Mary experiences this work of grace. So there are debates about the Immaculate Conception. These debates go all the way back to the Middle Ages. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, rejects the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, which was not a dogma at this time. And so the Pope, at this time, he writes Ubi Primum in 1849, where he is requesting responses from a variety of bishops regarding some of these debated questions about Mary. And as I said, Pius IX himself wasn't some kind of amazing academic or theologian, and so he's relying on those bishops who are more experts within theological fields to get some input from them about this. And then he releases this document, and this document is really essential for the dogma of papal infallibility, and that is Ineffabilis Deus in 1854, and it is here that Pius IX declares that the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Mother is a dogma. So he declares simply that this is true and that the Church teaches this and must teach this. Pius is really using the dogma of infallibility in his action here, even before that particular dogma has yet been ratified at any council at all. You don't really find anything like Ineffabilis Deus prior to this time. Popes certainly condemn people and condemn ideas, but you don't have such a direct declaration of a single pope outside of a council making such a clear dogmatic decree. And this decree is not only an affirmation of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, but there also are anathemas in this decree. There is an anathema against those who would disagree with this particular dogma. Now, you have some kind of parallels to this with, for example, the condemnation of Luther. And we'll talk about that actually, because that comes into some discussion about which exactly what's infallible. What encyclicals are infallible? What is it that the Pope has to do or say to make something an infallible statement? But nothing has been quite so pointed in precisely this way. And so he is using his own authority directly and singularly to simply say, this is true, and you are all bound to submit to it. Now, to be clear, he does come to this conclusion through the consultation of a variety of bishops. So he's not just bringing this up out of nowhere. However, he is exercising this pointed authority that moves beyond the way that popes have spoken in the past. All right. Now, here is this dogmatic statement. I'll read it for you from Ineffabilis Deus. He says, "We declare, pronounce, and define." This is unique. We don't see this kind of language elsewhere. "We declare, pronounce, and define that the doctrine which holds that the Most Blessed Virgin Mary, in the first instance of her conception, by a singular grace and privilege granted by Almighty God in view of the merits of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the human race, was preserved free from all stain of original sin, is a doctrine revealed by God, and therefore to be believed firmly and constantly by all the faithful." This is the kind of statement you'd see at something like the Council of Trent. This is a dogmatic declaration, which usually would be something that would arise out of the council. Now, I realize here that you can't see the entirety of this, so let me move this over a little bit. So now you have the Pope basically taking a conciliar type role. He's taking the role that a council would normally have in defining something as dogma. Okay. Now, I am also going to read this because I think that it is important, and I know this isn't directly just on Marian dogma, but I think it is important to see what exactly is included within this particular declaration. Because, yes, it is about Mary being free from the stain of original sin, but this is also a declaration of Marian piety in some significant ways. So I'll read the entirety of this for you here. I'll make sure that I move this so you can actually see the whole thing. Okay. "Let with all the children of the Catholic Church who are so very dear to us hear these words of ours. With a still more ardent zeal for piety, religion, and love, let them continue to venerate, invoke, and pray to the Most Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God, conceived without original sin. Let them fly with utter confidence to this most sweet Mother of mercy and grace in all dangers, difficulties, needs, doubts, and fears. Under her guidance, under her patronage, under her kindness and protection, nothing is to be feared, nothing is hopeless. Because, while bearing toward us a truly motherly affection, and having in her care the work of our salvation," that's bold, "she is solicitous about the whole human race. And since she has been appointed by God to be the Queen of heaven and earth, and is exalted above all the choirs of angels and saints, and even stands at the right hand of her only begotten Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, she presents our petitions in a most efficacious manner. When what she asks, she obtains. Her pleas can never be unheard. And I'm not going to spend time going theologically through that, and I would like to do a series on the Marian dogmas specifically, but I just want you to see what is actually being claimed in this dogma, because I think in a lot of these discussions, the focus on veneration that is there in Infallibilis Deus is not really focused on. So I want you to see what it actually claims. So we'll move on there. Okay, the Syllabus of Errors. Now, this is a very influential document, a much debated document, a much discussed document, both at the proceedings of and prior to the proceedings of Vatican I and after that time as well. And this particular document is Pius IX's strong condemnation of modernism. So what exactly is included within this strong condemnation? Well, this is brought about by one particular figure, a figure named Charles de Montalembert, who makes the argument, and he's an influential writer, and at the time wasn't really viewed, as far as I can tell, at least in the sources, it didn't seem that he was viewed as that controversial until this point. And essentially, as there are these constitutional states, like the United States, that are arising since the 18th century, and you have people pushing for similar things in Germany and other places, Montalembert argues that the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, should support religious liberty. And so he is essentially a Roman Catholic who is supportive of these constitutional societies. And Montalembert argues that, yes, there are elements of democratic society which are too secular or too religiously neutral, or maybe not even religiously neutral. Of course, you have things like, as we talked about before, the French Revolution, which is distinctively not neutral toward religion at all. And so Montalembert believes that democracy is a good thing, that constitutionalism is a good thing, but that we could do work to move these democratic societies in a more Christian direction, but that we could support the democratic process and we could support a constitutional form of government. And Montalembert argued that modern liberal governments, and we mean liberal in the sense of classical liberalism as we're talking about the whole political constitutional system. We're not talking about left versus right governments, but essentially those governments that arise from the thought of John Locke largely, though not exclusively. He says that liberal governments are to be preferred to strict monarchies, which had defined the papal states in the past. Now, of course, somebody like de Maistre would really hate this kind of perspective, but Montalembert is a bit of a modern man in many ways. I don't know, and I didn't do as much reading on him as I would like to have done, but at least from what I had seen and what I have read, I haven't seen that Montalembert was really arguing for any heterodox or heretical doctrine, in the sense that the Protestant liberals like Friedrich Schleiermacher were. So as far as I know, he believed in things like the existence of the supernatural and the historical veracity of the events in Scripture and things like that. But perhaps somebody who knows more than me could correct me on that. But it's at least what it appeared to me from what I had read. Okay, so there is then the writing of another document by Pope Pius IX that is in response to some bishops who are now supporting Montalembert's views. Essentially, they're saying, well, as Rome, we too can fit into the modern world, and we too can support a constitutional system. We don't have to just promote the strict monarchical systems that we have had in the past. And so it is then in response to this that Quantum Cura is written by Pope Pius IX. Now, there is a section of that which is called the Syllabus of Errors. This is 1865 for those who are listening and not viewing the PowerPoint here. But the Syllabus of Errors is what it sounds like. It is a collection of errors that are in Montalbert's writings that are being promoted by these particular bishops. So, what does the Syllabus of Errors condemn? The first point I mention here is the freedom of worship. And so this is, and there are a lot of interesting interpretations of this document today, especially from Roman Catholics in the United States. But the Syllabus of Errors condemns this promotion of the freedom of worship that was the case within liberal democracies. The Syllabus of Errors is more well known, though, for its strong condemnations of modernism. And so the Syllabus of Errors condemns modernism, rationalism, deism, all sorts of ideas and movements that really define this move away from traditional religious commitments during this time. And you can find this online pretty easily if you want to read the details of all of that. Okay, now, all of that sets the stage for what's going on historically, what's going on politically, who Pope Pius IX is, what kinds of errors and issues that he's responding to at his time. And now we're going to take a further step back and look at this debate which has been going on since the Middle Ages. And there are debates about the authority of the popes relative to the authority of church councils. And so we're talking here about ultramontanism, but before we jump into the phrase ultramontanism, we're going to quickly consider this debate that occurs in the Middle Ages between conciliarism and a strong papalism. Now, conciliarism is the view that the ultimate or highest authority in the church is council. So that authority in the church is not just concentrated on the singular office or singular figure of the Pope or the papacy. And the papalists, in contrast to this, believe essentially that authority is vested really just in that singular figure, and that the authority of the councils, if they have authority, really just arises out of the authority of the Pope. And so the authority kind of comes down from the Pope and goes into the councils, to the point that after Vatican I, there are a lot of people that make arguments that, as strange as this may seem, that even things like the Council of Nicaea actually had no authority in and of themselves. They needed to be confirmed by the Pope if they were to have any validity, which is a bizarre argument that I don't think most people want to make today, but that is at least how a significant number of people read the conclusions of Vatican I. This debate really comes to its head in the 14th century, where you have this great papal schism. And the great papal schism is another fun historical event that I could spend an hour on, but it's kind of a wild time. But here is where you have essentially what ends up being three different individuals who all claim to be the valid pope. And so you have the papacy moves to Avignon in France, and then you have this one person who's installed, and then you have another pope who's in Rome, and then you have this third pope that's meant to be installed as the true pope to kind of get rid of the debate between the other two. And now you've got three, and none of them are going to step down. Eventually they get rid of all three, and you've got another pope. This leads to this significant loss of trust in the authority of the papacy at this time. Like, how could it not? The whole thing is like a circus. And so it's at this time that now people are starting to say, what actually is the authority of the popes? And this was especially true because a council then was convened in order to get rid of those popes. So the church had to, whether it wanted to or not, wrestle with this question of where does authority ultimately lie? Is it found in the church as a whole, especially as it meets in those councils, or is it found just within the papal office? You have people like Robert Bellarmine who are able to say things like, the church is the pope. And those kinds of statements do show up once again at Vatican I, Not that that particular statement is ratified by Vatican I by any means, but you have people using that kind of language who follow that Robert Bellarmine kind of strain of thinking. The Council of Constance is then meets, and the Council of Constance is known to a lot of Protestants, especially as the council where John Huss was condemned, where the church lied about safe passage and just decided that lying to heretics was cool and burned him at the stake. And this was 1414 to 1418. And the Council of Constance pretty clearly affirms the conciliarist position. And for this reason, when you look at some of the debates during Vatican I, there are a lot of people who are trying to argue that Constance was not an ecumenical council because it seems to contradict what was decreed at Vatican I. And so but at the same time, they can't exactly reject all that was decreed at the Council of Constance. And so they want to say, well, it was a valid council, but not all of its actions were binding, and that poses one of the most significant challenges to the veracity of papal infallibility. But then you have the rise of ultramontanism, and ultramontanism is basically the word that is used to define the strong papalist position, the anti-conciliarist position that arises in France in the 18th century. And so the ultramontanists are critics not just of conciliarism in the church, but they are critics of constitutional democratic societies in Europe. So they're critics of the liberal order within Europe and then the United States. They are defenders of the papal states. So you had what are called the papal states, which were territories that were not governed constitutionally, but were ruled directly by the Pope. And there was this increased threat that the papal states were going to be overthrown, which is a significant element, along with everything else we've talked about, a significant political factor that was in view during Vatican I. They eventually fall in 1870, the same year that the First Vatican Council meets. And Vatican I essentially affirms what is the ultramontanist position and rejects pretty clearly the conciliarist position. And there is then going to be, following this at Vatican II, a move back to the conciliarist position at that council, and a seeming embrace of much of the ideas of modernity that Pope Pius IX condemns, which again, I think poses another significant challenge to the council and the claims of the papacy. So what actually happens then at the council? Well, Pope Pius IX calls the First Vatican Council on June 29th in 1868, and it really was meant to deal with the threat to the papal states from the Kingdom of Italy at this time. So again, it was largely a political issue that had to be dealt with theologically, but there isn't this strong divide between politics and theology that we often think of today, and sometimes wrongly think of today. Okay, so what actually happens at the council as they gather together? Well, there are just over 700 bishops who are present at this particular council. There are a significant number of criticisms of the bishops that Pope Pius IX happened to call to the council. And so 120 of those bishops were what are called titular bishops. Now, these are bishops who actually do not have any territory at all. So traditionally, when you think of a bishop is a bishop over a particular territory. Now, within a Lutheran theological context, we do not speak about pastors apart from calls or bishops apart from calls. And so we would say that when you're ordained to the office of the holy ministry, you have to be ordained with a call. So in other words, you have to actually have a call to a congregation, or whether it's a missionary call or something else. But it's not just, you're not just called to that office kind of in the abstract. And so in those Lutheran churches that do have a kind of episcopacy, it's always going to be functional in the way that it works. In other words, you don't get the title unless you're actually doing the work. So the bishop is defined in many ways by what the bishop is doing, essentially being this pastor who's overseeing other pastors. Though not all Lutheran churches have that exact ecclesiastical structure. But Rome has this idea of these titular bishops. So essentially individuals can be appointed as bishops even if they have no territory at all. And Pius IX himself appointed many of these 120 bishops. So the critique that you find, especially in those who break off and form the old Catholic Church after Vatican I, a large portion of this critique is going to be that this was really unjust, that the Pope essentially decided that he was going to call people that supported his cause and make them bishops and then give them a significant voice at this council, even though they were not actually bishops in any real sense or a functional sense. Now, this isn't the first time that this kind of thing has happened, but it happened, I believe, at least some of the claims of the critics is that this happened to a much greater degree here, where there were a far more significant percentage of bishops that were appointed, seemingly precisely for that purpose. Another critique that is levied at the council is that Vatican I had a strongly disproportionate number of Italian bishops. And the Italian bishops were the biggest supporters of the papal state and were those who would have been most willing to affirm the dogma of infallibility. And the bishops from those constitutional states, England and the United States, tended to be the most critical of the proposed dogma of papal infallibility. And so the criticism at the time is that essentially the Pope stacked the deck with all the people that are going to agree with him. And so he already made this decision, papal infallibility is going to become a dogma of the Church, and in order to do that, he basically decides that he needs to appoint those bishops to make this decision who are going to affirm the decision that he has already made. That's at least the critique that is offered at that time. And so this bias here toward the conclusion that Pius already wanted the council to go to is also evident in that almost every theologian who's asked to drab the schemata for the council are ultramontanists. And so those who affirm his position already are the ones who write all of these statements. And papal infallibility is not the only thing that's mentioned here at Vatican I, by the way. There are more statements other than just that. And there's a more fully fleshed out doctrine of the papacy there than just dealing with this one particular issue. There are some initial requests that the dogma of infallibility would be discussed separately from the rest of these issues. Those are refused initially, though at some point it really does become a separate issue in debate during the proceedings of the council. But the critique is that this appears to be, the Pope appears to have manipulated things in certain ways that would assure the result that he wanted. Okay, the doctrine of the council. So let's talk about what the doctrinal positions are of those who show up at the council. So the biggest pressing concern at this point is the political threat. And the theology of infallibility was, for some of these bishops, and they're very concerned about the political situation as well, because when you are in a strongly Roman Catholic state and you are a bishop, your authority, it's ecclesiastical primarily, but it's not only ecclesiastical. And so for some, the dogma of papal infallibility seems to have been considered more in terms of the political ramifications than actually in light of, say, the theological and scriptural arguments that would support such a thing. Now, there are three groups that show up, essentially three groups. And anytime we're talking about a council like this, we're trying to roughly define them. So it's not like you've got your, they've all got like little hats that define which of these three clubs are you part of. So there's some variance here. But you have your strong ultramontanists. And so these are those who are just staunch defenders of the office of the papacy as foundational to both the church and all political order. you have those who are basically okay with infallibility. They're fine affirming it, mostly because of the political issues, but they're not, they're not going to jump on board with Robert Bellarmine's, statement that the Pope is the Church. And then you have a group of opponents. Now, the opponents were relatively small, and generally those bishops who would have been the strongest opponents were not actually present at the council. Now, the claim is at least made by the critics that all of the strongest and most qualified historians that were present at the council were on the opposing side. And then you have John Henry Newman, even, who's at least privately very skeptical of this dogma and does not want it to be declared dogma, even though though he publicly doesn't say anything about it. There's a leak of a private letter of his, which he probably would not have wanted. Okay. So Pastor Aeternus, the eternal pastor. This is the decree here that talks about the infallibility. So initially, the papal infallibility is not mentioned explicitly here in the first draft, the first formulation of this. And there is this debate that is occurring at this time at the council, which is the Pope infallible on his own or only in connection with the Church? And so those bishops who are present at this council are debating this back and forth. The strong ultramontanists, of course, are the ones that are going to say, yes, it's all on his own. The authority is solely within the office of the Pope. Supposedly, at least one account from this council has Pope Pius IX, a humble man as he was, saying at one point in these debates, I am the Church. I am the tradition. The height of papal claims and arrogance that we find there in Pius IX. Similar to some things that Pope Innocent III in the Middle Ages would say about himself as well. Pastor Aeternus affirms that Peter's authority is direct. In other words, the authority is not one that is given by the Church or delegated from the Church, but it is Jesus gives the keys to Peter explicitly. He doesn't give the keys to the other apostles to then give them to Peter, but he gives it to Peter explicitly. That's the argument, which is understandable from a textual perspective. If you want to take that interpretation of Matthew 16, that this is about the papal office, which of course I don't think is the case. But Peter's authority is directly given and it's perpetual. And so there is not really any break in that Petrine authority. Leads to all sorts of challenges historically, but that's the claim. And ultimately, Pastor Aeternus determines that when the Pope speaks authoritatively, and this is the question, when is the Pope speaking authoritatively? And there isn't always agreement on what that means, but when the Pope speaks authoritatively, those declarations that he makes authoritatively are infallible declarations. And it is very clear that rejection of this teaching, the rejection of the teaching of the doctrine of papal infallibility, endangers one's salvation. And so this is a significant issue that for Rome is directly related to your own salvation. And so here I have the actual statements from Vatican I on this issue, so we can read them directly instead of just me summarizing what they mean, so you see what they actually say. They say this: we teach and define as a divinely revealed dogma, so divinely revealed, just as things in Scripture are, that when the Roman pontiff speaks ex cathedra, that is when he's speaking on his papal throne, that is, when in the exercise of his office as a shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole Church, he possesses, by the divine assistance promised to him in Blessed Peter, that infallibility which the divine Redeemer willed his Church to enjoy in defining doctrine concerning faith or morals. Therefore, such definitions of the Roman pontiff are of themselves and not by the consent of the Church, irreformable. Not by the consent of the Church. So there is a very explicit rejection of the conciliarist position at Vatican I. Okay, so those are the claims that are being made. Now, we then have to start to explore a number of things as we move forward in this series. The things that we have to explore are, one, what does it mean that the Pope is speaking ex cathedra? What is actually being defined as infallible here? And there are some Roman Catholics who try to make the argument that essentially an ex cathedra teaching or declaration has only happened twice in the history of the entire Church. And that is in the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, and then the dogma of the bodily Assumption in 1950. That is not, from what I can read, when I have read, in terms of the proponents of Vatican I, that is not the argument that they seemed to make regarding what an infallible statement is, though even at the council and immediately following the council, there is a significant amount of debate about what constitutes an ex cathedra statement, and so we'll try to explore exactly what that means and what makes a certain statement an infallible statement as opposed to something like a mere opinion that a certain individual pope may have, or theological advice that a pope may give. And then we're going to look at the arguments that are set forth in favor of this very strong doctrine of papal authority, and look at them both in Scripture and in history, and look at some of the historical challenges faced here. So, okay, let's then look at... didn't mean to do that. Okay, let's then look at what are some of the sources to end here, to just say, these are the things that I've looked at. So you know what I'm reading. I think it's important to do that, to say I'm not just, going on Protestant, apologetics websites. Not that there really are those like there are for Rome, so I don't know what that would be. Okay. All right. So a couple websites that I reference a lot. NewAdvent.org is always a good one for just getting basic Roman Catholic doctrine on a number of issues. PapalEncyclicals.net just contains all papal encyclicals, just as the title states. So this is a really helpful place to go if you want to read some of these things yourself. And not only their English translations, but the Latin texts are there as well, if you're able to read those. Books that I looked at: Catechism of the Catholic Church. Obviously, that was pretty clear. The Consensus of the Church and Papal Infallibility by Richard Costigan. The Doctrine of Papal Infallibility Stated and Vindicated by John Walsh. Papal Infallibility by Mark Powell. Papal Infallibility, Its Complete Collapse Before a Factual Investigation. Oh boy, by J.B. Rowell. That book was not very good. It was pretty bad. It wasn't really like a book. It was just like a series of statements that were disconnected. Two Paths, Orthodoxy and Catholicism, Roman Catholic Claims of Papal Supremacy in the Light of Orthodox Christian Teaching by Michael Welton. His Broken Body, Understanding and Healing the Schism Between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Churches by Laurent Kleinwerk. Those have really good treatments of some of the historical challenges faced by papal claims, especially infallibility. And those are obviously by Eastern Orthodox authors, and so they're not going to take a sola scriptura perspective. But I think they are very helpful in showing what are some of the significant challenges that the claims of papal authority really have to take into account. Then we have John Henry Newman's letter to Bishop Ullathorne that I had mentioned, which was meant as a private letter, but somehow got out publicly. Declaration and Letters on the Vatican Decrees by Johann Dollinger. That's one that is recommended very often. It shows up all over the place in modern literature as well. Letters from Rome on the Council by Lord Acton. The True Story of the Vatican Council by Edward Manning. And the Vatican Council by Dom Butler. So a lot of text there, and I'm just reading a list, but I know that some of you sometimes want to know what sources that I'm using for these kinds of things, and I want to show that I am indeed, yes, using many sources, including those that are favorable toward Rome's decisions here. So I hope you found this helpful. I know this was history. This isn't really the kind of meat of the arguments here that I know some of you are probably really wanting to see. We're getting there, but the historical context is very important to put these things in place so that we understand why the arguments that are being made at this particular time. So make sure you subscribe here on YouTube and on your podcast app, whatever that may be, for future videos and podcasts like this. And we'll see you in the next one. God bless.